Kirito Kamui, the antagonist of the second season of Psycho-Pass, is a character who is often subject to criticism along with the second season of the show. Some view him as an inferior version of Makishima, and as a result of the poor reception of this season, much of the scorn is directed towards this season's antagonist. However, I think he is rather interesting and actually fits the second season thematically quite well, as he provides an alternative viewpoint to Makishima which was equally valid. Unlike Makishima, who was outright denying the system, Kamui held the opinion that with improvements, the system could be used to create a just, utopian society as per its original goal. By raising a question about all the contradictions within the system and the exceptions that it does not take into account, he's essentially debugging the system and improving it. His biggest qualm with the system and the point of his character is to introduce the concept of who judges the judge. If the collective that is Sybil cannot be regularly judged and purged of subjectivity, that raises a big contradiction. Essentially, he wants Sybil to prove that it is currently impartial and will remain impartial, which is why he wants the system itself to be tested to the same degree as its citizens. Of course, that point is what leads to what happens with Sybil at the end of the season. However, this questions how Sybil was able to purge individuals within itself, since it should be made of completely asymptomatic individuals in an attempt to create an objective system. So the existence of individuals that can be purged questions the authenticity and subjectivity of the system, which is another hole Kamui is able to expose. The system clearly has certain parameters that are able to determine latent criminals, but this characteristic does not show up in asymptomatic people. I'm not entirely sure how at the end of the season Sybil finds that indicator within people who shouldn't have it, unless these individuals stop being asymptomatic when they become a member of Sybil. Just as everyone else in society is able to change based on stressful situations, and due to new information and experiences, like how the victims started to register as targets of enforcement, perhaps their brains adapt based on that experience and decisions they make as they are faced with being pseudo-omnipotent. Perhaps their new state of being is so different that their thoughts, reactions, and likeliness can now be read. If that is the case, then the Sybil system could simply create an average based on the crime coefficients of each member, which would then allow them to eliminate the outliers. A large reason for the general dislike of Kamui is likely because the origin of his body and the reason he is impervious to Sybil is rather hard to understand and a bit far-fetched. Also, many concepts within the second season aren't explained thoroughly, such as how Sybil lacked the ability to judge collectives, but was still able to represent an area-level assessment. Were these area-level assessments the mean of the psychopath levels of the individuals? That would not be a very good method of measurement, since many individuals in society have become disconnected from crime because of the Sybil system and may not recognize clearly wrong actions. Kamui is frustrated in Sybil's inability to judge him, which effectively questions his existence entirely. It creates an identity complex within him, and it becomes one of the driving forces in him doing the actions he does, in order to become accepted as a person by Sybil, to reaffirm his own personality, identity, and existence of those he carries within himself. A lot of the dissatisfaction comes from these concepts being explained insufficiently. The biological nature of Kamui and the inherent comparisons with Makishima, which leads to a dislike towards this season and Kamui in particular, as well as the distinct lack of Kogami, which leads to Akane carrying the majority of the season. One aspect I really appreciate within this season is that Akane, while still disliking the lack of transparency in the Sybil system and how harsh it is, she is still aware that the safety obtained by the Sybil system is too precious and shouldn't be jeopardized by telling the truth to the world, especially when compared to how many other countries are struggling and how Japan actually has it very good in comparison to most of the world. She essentially sees it as a potentially necessary evil. Both Akane and Kamui acknowledge that there are benefits to the system and that there is potential or hope for it to truly become adequate, or that at the very least it is necessary to maintain in this turbulent time for the world, as was highlighted in the Psycho-Pass movie. Unlike Makishima, who values freedom above all else and wanted to expose and abolish the system to give authoritarian power back to the people rather than the entity. This season strove towards evolving the Sybil system and exposing some of its contradictions, defects, and issues in the way it operates, challenging the Sybil system with the omnipotence paradox, which debates if God could create a stone so heavy he himself could not lift, essentially questioning whether Sybil is even fit to judge itself, since it is omnipotent in nature and the individuals that make it up are not like regular individuals, and therefore Sybil's parameters may not be adequate to judge itself in the first place. It's a very interesting concept that challenges the existence of Sybil itself. Kamui fights in order to be recognized by the system, which essentially determines everything in society. In a world where everyone else is recognized, He wants the system to be able to see him as a person, as well as be able to be judged. A lot of his character revolves around his frustration at the civil system for its inability to judge him. Kamui also raises a very interesting question in whether it is right to persecute a group of innocents in the name of the greater good, whether society's benefits should outweigh the individuals. He mentions how the civil system is also responsible for the passive attitude of people, because the burden of making your own choices according to your moral compass and principles is done by civil instead. This abstinence causes the people's indifference when faced with a crime in front of their very eyes. And Kamui hacking the video game in which enforcers are killed in place of fictional characters shows the detachment of ordinary people from real events and their lack of understanding and empathy towards one another. It is his critique of the system that makes many of the ethical questions he raises quite interesting and make him a villain that fits Psycho-Pass thematically very well. Makishima represents the desire to purge Sybil, while Kamui represents the desire to reform it. And it is Akane's experience with both these individuals that will allow her to form her decision regarding how she wants to deal with Sybil and perhaps come up with an answer.